Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this third session of the OTT Conference, third main session of the OTT Conference. And today we're going to talk about the relationship between think tanks and social movements, NGOs, advocacy organizations, activists. This is a subject that has been high on our own agenda at OTT. A few years ago, we did a study on think tanks and social movements. We thought that offered lots of interesting questions about those relationships, how they come about, what motivates them, how it's sustained, and what value can policy researchers provide social movements on, and vice versa. And so we've always wanted to continue the conversation. Today we have a great panel that we're going to start with. And as always, I'm going to ask them to share with us some ideas, some experiences, some examples, anecdotes from their work that help us answer questions around why are these collaborations and partnerships important, how can they work, how they work best, and what can think tanks, as a reflection at the end, what could think tanks do to make sure that those collaborations happen and that they have the results that we hope for. So we have Anna Taylor. She's Executive Director of the Food Foundation in the UK. We have Donald Deya. He's the Chief Executive Officer for the Pan-African Lawyers Union and also part of the Stop the Bleeding Coalition. We have Laurie Laybourn-Langton from Ippr, who's done a study on social movements, but also works in a think tank. And we have Laurie from Ippr in Senegal, a think tank as well, primarily working in the rural agricultural sector, if I'm correct, Lo. So we're going to start with Anna, then Don, then Laurie, and then I'm going to ask Lo to come in and provide a commentary and get us started with some questions. For everybody else, please use the chat to ask your own questions, add your own comments, and also start by telling us who you are and where you're joining us from. So Anna, why don't you tell us about the story of the Food Foundation and your most recent campaign that I heard was a bit of a success.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the invitation to be here. Looking forward to the conversation with you all. The Food Foundation is a UK-based charity working on food system change, so everyone in Britain can afford to eat healthily and sustainably. And we, the example that I wanted to talk about today, of which hopefully contributes to this broader conversation about think tanks and social movements. The story really began at the beginning of the pandemic, when we recognised quite quickly that the economic situation for millions of families in Britain was going to deteriorate sharply. At that point, we were uncertain how the pandemic would impact on the food system itself and supplies in supermarkets and so forth. But we quite quickly decided that we should start measuring access to food. And we did so using a very standardized approach used in many countries and also used by the UK government in a big annual survey that it does. The problem with the UK government data is that it's typically a year out of date when it's published, in the sense there's a big lag time because it's like a massive survey with multiple indicators. So we were doing something that was still nationally representative, but focusing on a small number of questions and not such a huge sample. So we started this process in April 2020, and we've actually just completed our 10th survey. So we've been continuing that work throughout the last 2 years. And during the early months of the pandemic, it became an incredibly useful tool for talking to policymakers, businesses, and to the media about what was happening on the ground and the impact the pandemic was having on levels of food insecurity. We were, at the time focusing on a number of policy suggestions, including focusing on children who are eligible for free school meals in Britain. So these are the most disadvantaged children, and also thinking about how the social welfare system, the benefit system, could be used to protect families. During this time, though, then something kind of rather surprising happened, in that a Premier League footballer who plays for Manchester United and the England side, so a well-known name in the public eye in the UK, store our data and was concerned about children who are eligible for free school meals in Britain, but were at the time schools were closed, and there was the approaching summer holidays when those children would not be eligible for meals during the holidays. And he raised his concerns about this with MPs, and he used our data because our data was in the, being regularly cited by the media. We didn't have a relationship with him at all until that point. And because he himself had had experiences of food poverty as a child, his voice was incredibly authentic as somebody that knew personally about what this meant for children, and spoke out in a very apolitical way about trying to get the situation addressed. Fast forward a little bit, at the same time the government had commissioned a national food strategy. We were quite involved in working on that team, developing a national food strategy. One of the recommendations was around ensuring that children were protected during the holidays for children that were on free school meals. And then Marcus decided that he was going to convene a group of industry leaders to raise awareness about the issue. And in parallel, we convened a group of civil society, all under the banner of an End Child Food Poverty Coalition. And the campaign began, and we worked very closely with Marcus to bring people's lived experience and stories to the public. There was a lot of detail. I won't labor all the detail. It's a fairly long story, but the campaign culminated in the autumn of 2020 with a parliamentary petition, which within about 10 days got 1.1 million signatures. I think it was one of the fastest growing petitions ever that's been on the UK Parliament. The story was headline news for about a week, and what we found was not only did people want to sign the petition, but as we approached the half-term period when children were going to be on holiday, businesses all around the country said they were going to put in place provision for children who were eligible for free school meals. And so we created a map which showed where all of this provision was happening. Anyway, in the autumn budget, which soon followed after that, the government announced that it would put in place a national programme for children during the school holidays who were eligible for free school meals. At that point, that was a cost of about £200 million. At that point, that commitment was only for a year, but a year later they committed for another 2 years. So we now we've got a programme running for another couple of years, which is really fantastic, particularly given the cost of living crisis, which is now getting incredibly serious in the UK. One just final point, that just gives you a bit of an example, I suppose, but I did want to also say that now I think coming out of that period of quite intense work around food poverty and now entering a new period around a very intense work around food poverty because of the cost of living crisis, we're finding that the public narrative around this issue has changed dramatically in the last 3 years in the UK. And we're sort of conscious that all that groundwork that you do in gathering evidence and trying to find compelling ways of presenting that evidence to different audiences is enormously valuable for when that moment does arrive, when it creates a kind of an opportunity for an issue to suddenly become incredibly politically potent. So anyway, that's just some reflections that hopefully kick us off.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story, and I think you're right. It's you've been working on this issue for a long time. Sort of grinding the data, making recommendations. An opportunity arises, unfortunately, a crisis, but also a connection to another actor, other actors who can raise the argument, put it on the agenda, and then help you get those solutions to to those who had to make the decisions. And as you say, the story doesn't end, right? Because there's a new crisis and there are new solutions that are sought, but the narrative has changed. And I guess that is one of the reasons why think tanks working with social movements or activists can get more done, because they can also change the narrative, not just provide solutions, but change the narrative that is required for those solutions to be accepted and push forward. Dawn, I mean, that's sort of what you're trying to do, right? Even the name of this coalition of organizations, it's sort of about a narrative. It's about it's big ideas, not just small solutions, but you're trying to capture the imagination, capture people's attention. Can you tell us a little bit about Stop the Bleeding Coalition and different organizations there? What lessons have you learned from that process or others?
Okay, thank you, Enrique. I can talk about that. So we have something called Stop the Bleeding Consortium. And it's very funny because separately, I'll tell you also about something called Stop the Bleeding Campaign and how the consortium and the campaign relate. So the consortium is a small, close-knit group of 7 organizations. Some are think tanks, some membership organizations, although they consider themselves to have a think tank function as well. Some are NGOs. We are all Pan-African level, meaning operating at the African continental level, but with tentacles, of course, across the continent, in the regions and in the countries. And we work on economic justice issues and economic governance issues. Basically, that's why we are called Stop the Bleeding, trying to stop the bleeding of African resources, especially through illicit financial flows, through the activities of huge multinational corporations and so on. And we've been working together in this space for several years, initially quite loosely. Then lately, we have now formed into a very tight-knit group where we're literally almost like one organization in terms of having one philosophy, one ideology, one work plan, and different organizations do different parts of it. So years ago, about 5 years ago, at a seminal moment in Africa, when the African Union was about to make a monumental statement on the issue of illicit financial flows from Africa, we decided to initiate a campaign. So we called different kinds of actors, NGOs, grassroots movements, trade unions, faith-based movements, artists, musicians, and so on. And we all did coordinated across the continent lots of activities to raise awareness on these issues of illicit financial flows and to push for a strong policy statement from the African Union, which we eventually got, a declaration, a high-level declaration. So we did that. So we really ended up kicking off a campaign that's slowly evolving into a movement, so to speak, across the continent. And there are actors, various actors, as I said, some working continentally, some working regionally, some working within the countries, and some working at the community level. And then we, who in a loose manner had begun this process, now, while we're part of it, went and now formed the consortium. We're working very closely together. So we consider ourselves like a small circle within a much larger circle. So there's a whole campaign that's morphing into the movement, and we are in it. We don't own it, we don't control it, but we try to influence it and to leverage on it. So our lesson, and I think we're not the first, I've come across such stories from colleagues from South America. Our lesson is that a think tank can start a movement. But more importantly, also, a think tank can be part of a movement. And I think the main thing is to see how to navigate your space so you neither dominate nor get overwhelmed by the movement, which is, of course, organic and it's moving in its own direction, and new actors are coming in using different kinds of activism, of different kinds of campaigning, and so on. One other lesson we've learned for us, I think, especially because at least we're equally named, there's a larger, more amorphous Stop the Bleeding campaign, which has achieved some sort of brand recognition with governments, with intergovernmental bodies, is that when we now go as individual organizations, the individual 7, or when we go as a consortium, for instance, to engage government, we find that the fact that there's a feeling that there's a huge force behind us gives us more leverage, more stature with those we're negotiating with in government. So that's been one of our lessons. One of the questions to ask, which we haven't answered because this thing is evolving, we're still learning, is in this particular instance, we're engaging as institutions. 7 institutions are part of a movement. 7 institutions are formed a consortium as part of a movement. Others might prefer that it is the individuals within the institution that become part of the movement, and the institution per se is not part of the movement. But it's early days yet for us in this one. It's an evolving thing, but a situation where think tanks actually did start a movement that they're part of, that they no longer totally control. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. I think that's a key question, right? So often think tanks feel very nervous about letting their work, out of their hands, and they would like to control the research process. Researchers want to control the research process. They want to control how the findings are communicated. They want to control who gets to use those findings and for what. But often they can't. Right? Often those findings are used by somebody else, and in this case, you are letting go not just of the research, but you're letting go of that initiative, that motivation that you had in the beginning. We've lost Laurie, but I'm going to ask Laurie to come in and maybe start us with an initial reflection from these 2 presentations, and I'll give you the right to ask the first questions, and then I'll follow up with a couple of questions and comments.
Thank you, Enrique. It's very interesting to talk about think tank and social movement. And as a new think tanker, I have to say that for me, it's the same. We are part of the social movement in Ippr, but I can understand why it is a question for some of my colleagues here. In Senegal, for example, there is no such organization category as think tank. So think tank are part of civil society organization. So they are part of social movements. And I was wondering, how do you navigate independence in your research, potential levels to make sure that your research is used to be put in action, and social movements. Anna was talking about the research that was not really put into the view of the public eye, and that was then really reused or used by a popular persona, and then they get the attention, and they got the finance that they wanted to have. And Don was having an example where they were really part of the reasoning, the campaign, the advocacy, using their results. What is the right or the easier place for a think tank in the social movements? The question is for Anna and Don.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. So I think that's similar to what you were reflecting on, Don, right? So what is the place of the think tank? Is it you at some points you're a driver, some points you are observing, some points you're supporting, some points you are just providing information. Maybe you're just playing a passive role or a proactive role. And is that something that you already notice in the coalition, that some members of this group are playing different roles depending on their area, on their expertise? And then maybe I'll go to Anne in terms of, you mentioned that you were not planning for your data to be picked up by a Premier League footballer, but now that it's happened, what are you doing differently in future work? How are you trying? Are you trying to get it picked up again? And what things are you trying to do? So, Don, maybe you can reflect on the different roles that everybody plays.
Okay. Yeah, I think for us, if I would say one thing is that it's been quite a learning curve for us, and the posture we've adopted is one of learning. because similarly, when we were starting out, there was quite some trepidation around how would you deal with that larger marketplace, that larger village that has different sorts of actors that act differently. So we started out, I would say, being a bit stiff. But then we realized that when we see how activists, how campaigners do their stuff, which is very different from the stiff kind of think tank advocacy that we've been used to, it helped loosen us up a bit, and also just appreciate how multiplicity of actors causes change on a thing. So we find that we're being called upon from time to time to provide almost some kind of intellectual rigor, some kind of intellectual leadership, provide products, provide research, provide statistics, and so on that people then break down. It's also forced us to learn to go beyond our policy briefs and our journals and our books, even when we publish those, to then use art, use music to break it down to language that the ordinary person can understand. So there's been a mutuality where we're kind of being enriched by engaging with the diversity of actors. And sometimes we just sit back and learn, and sometimes we're at the back of the queue. But from time to time, we are also called upon to be a bit more proactive in providing, kind of direction or rigor or depth to what is going on. So we've learned to produce cartoons or work with others that can reduce our work into cartoons, into pictures, into, song. And now we are almost at the level of saying, can we enter into this space called TikTok? But we don't feel we have to do everything. Within the movement, others can.
Thank you. Anna, what about, what about how are you planning for the future? How are you deciding what your role is going forward? Are you going to say, I'm going to try to always play this role as the kind of technical partner to a footballer, or are there other roles that the Food Foundation can play based on this experience?
I think, we started off putting a lot of energy into the communication of our data, and we're continuing to do that because we're realizing how vital that is. So really investing in our communications and public affairs sort of functions remains a really big priority, because we've learned that was one of the key ingredients for this to happen. I think we also learnt, which we kind of knew, but I think it reinforced it really to us, the importance of people's lived experience and the authenticity of people's voices running alongside sort of hard numbers. So the stories as well as the data, and we try to always push both of those aspects in all of our work. But I think the campaign just reinforced for us how important that authenticity is for in the UK context at the moment. I imagine that would vary from place to place in different political contexts, but it's very important here at the moment. And then I think the last thing we probably really learned was that we're a team of 15 people running a big campaign where you get millions of citizens to take action is not something that we can pull off by any means on our own. And I don't think we would enter into an ambition to do that without really having confidence that we've got the right partnerships or the right, sets of actors around the issue who do have the capacity to have that level of public reach and engagement. We've learned that, and we've also learned that, getting that magic is, we were incredibly lucky, really, in many ways, with a set of circumstances which aligned. So as much as we're trying to nurture, lots of those opportunities, we're very mindful of the fact that not many of them will come ultimately to fruition. But so yeah, we learned a huge amount through the process, and have reflected a lot on what that means for us. I think we're still convinced that our role of bringing evidence to light and communicating it powerfully is where we can add the most value in relation to what everybody else is doing. So not a kind of major sort of strategic direction shift, I would say.
That's interesting. I think both you and Dawn have alluded to. I'm sharing the IPPR study that Laurie was going to talk about, and their first in the chat, the first finding of that study, I think, is that evidence is not enough. That it's not just the evidence that was necessary, but it's about telling compelling stories that speak to people's values and identities, right? That capture the existing sources of power, or try to build alternative ways of thinking. Those narratives that both Dawn and Anna you've been talking about, and the connection to the public, the connection to those stories that individuals can provide, or that groups can offer. I think that certainly is, seems to coincide with your experiences. At the risk of losing what Laurie was going to say, I'm just going to follow up on the other two insights that their work came up with. So one of them being that in this case, they were studying social movements and looking at the lessons from successful social movements, and they talk about the fact that movements need a well-developed ecosystem of influence, right? They need breadth, that's diversity. They need depth, they need capability to mobilize resources, money, talent, knowledge, and they need interconnection in a community. They have to be well connected within the group, but also with other actors. And I think you've both alluded to that need to connect to others, and so that others can do their role in pushing change forward. A third insight I have is that successful movements are rarely organic. They require active cultivation. They require someone or groups that are convening, that are providing resources, that are taking care of the community as a whole, of perceived failures, addressing tensions between different groups within the group, and also of allowing for learning to happen throughout the community, so shared learning. So I thought that was interesting. You alluded to that, Dawn, as well, about this objective to learn as you go in the process, sort of dynamic learning or dynamic evaluation, maybe from a more kind of think tanky point of view. And then finally, they say successful movements. For successful movements, prepare for and then harness external events. So you've got to keep up with what's happening around you and respond to those events. I guess in your case, Anna, you've talked about the movement, the collaboration, to some extent the movement, being triggered by an event, the pandemic and the effect this was having on children. But then there's a new event just now, food crises, the rising cost of living, and you've got to react to that event as well. And then finally, movements, they have to mind their assets and address their limitations, right? They have to work with what they have, and take advantage of every resources that they have at hand, because it's hard to fund a movement, right? It's hard to fund the whole movement. You kind of are supporting different parts of the organization. So let me go back to you, Dawn. How do you handle that? How do you handle every organization in the coalition that is sort of nurturing, is cultivating, that is sort of trying to encourage a wider circle to act, as a movement? You're different types of organizations. You have different resources, right? Some of you maybe get funding from different foundations and different sources. You have different skills. How do you manage who plays what role in that coalition? Who leads on some things, who supports on other things, so that it's as equal as possible?
I mean, that's a constant challenge, especially because, as you correctly say, we are organizations of different ages, some of them with different amount of resources, staff resources, financial resources, technical resources. What we tried to do, especially in the consortium of 7, was very consciously think of who we're bringing on board and that we're covering different niches. So for instance, you find we've got the Pan-African Lawyers Union, they're covering law. You've got the Trade Union Confederation, the Africa chapter, they mobilize the trade union and the workers. We've got two feminist organizations. One is a general aggregate that brings together women's rights activists on a whole range of issues, including economics. And one, which really is an offshoot, is a feminist economic collective, And we've got others that deal with development, fundraising, and so on. So because there's an instinctive division of labor, we find that we don't get to clash that much. But just like building any consortium, any coalition, a lot of work has to be put into the health of the consortium, of the group of 7. So we have a leadership that rotates, and it's part of the work of the chair to speak to the people as a group, but also one by one to make sure that the health of the coalition is going on well. With the larger movement, I think when the pain dropped for us, that we can't control this and we really shouldn't be struggling to control it, it then made work much easier for us. We're less stiff, we're less panicky. We did not feel that even if, and it hasn't really happened to us, that, somebody does something that's untoward, comes up maybe with a policy position that's different from ours, that hasn't happened yet, really. It's differences of campaigning styles. But we kind of feel that even if that were to happen, there's enough knowledge already of these 7 institutions and of the consortium that people will be able to separate that didn't come from you. But yeah, as I said, maybe when we hit one major bump in the road like that, we'd learn differently. But as of now, it was just the consciously telling ourselves, let go, let control of the movement. You can add value from time to time. You can jump and be in the leadership or in the vanguard from time to time, but you don't have to control everything.
Thank you. Laurie, do you wanna reflect on this most recent discussion, maybe?
I'll try to I hope that you don't have echo when I talk now. Okay, so my reflection is that we came to the point, hearing you both, that think tanks are still provider of evidence or providers of analysis, but certainly not the one leading social movements or supporting directly social movements. And I was wondering, how do we position ourselves, think tankers, in the influence and policy dialogue, if we think that we are just providers of evidence and analysis, but in the same time we're saying that we want to influence policies and organize multi-stakeholders dialogue or policy dialogue? How do we manage both ambitions over?
Is that because you see it as a risk for a think tank that is generating knowledge and at the same time, taking a position? I guess that's what think tanks do all the time. But if you engage with social movements, activist organizations, you are doing that in a more explicit way or more active way. Is that what you're trying to? Is that what you were asking? And is that a tension at Ippr? Is that something that at Ippr in Senegal you reflect on, you think about that there's a tension for the organization?
That's exactly in Ippr we are very much involved with farmer organization. The DNA of Ippr are other farmer organization thinking that they needed some analysis on evidences and research, but focused on their needs, and they were thinking that they were not able to find this type of analysis with national research institutions or research institutions that were working on agriculture. That's how Ippr was created. But now we are very keen on working with other farmer organizations, and we are very much involved with farmer organization, and we don't see, we think that we can still be independent, have good research and analysis, and still be part of this social farmer organization movement. And having this discussion today, it seems that we cannot be really part of it. We give some information, we give evidence, but we need to be careful on the way we engage in social movements. And I want just to have reflection on how far we can go and still be present ourselves as researchers and evidence provider, and be independent, and make sure that we are not tagged social movement before everything else. I am sorry if it's not very clear, but I'm sure Enrique, you can.
No, this is very. No, I think that was very clear, and so it makes me think about whether it's the subject matter of the issue or the group that you're working with. So I don't know, maybe it's, when we looked at the study on think tanks and social movements, we saw some cases on maybe women's rights movements when researchers at the think tanks were part of the movement. It was an issue that affected them as women or as men, you know, so they're part of the movement. Is it the case that because Ippr is working with farmer associations or groups, that there is the researchers at Ippr are not farmers, right? That there's a way of drawing a distinction. You might advocate for their rights, but you're not necessarily part of that movement. But it's different if you in the case of women or feminists in general in think tanks, actively participating on gender rights movements in Latin America or in Europe or in Africa, where they are part of that group. They are part of that community. I don't know. I take it to Dawn and to Anna if you want to reflect on Laura's comment about that independence, the perception of independence, or the ability, I guess, to be able to be critical about the movement itself, even if you're part of it, right? That you're not too deep in it, that you can't see that maybe things are not going as the evidence suggests that they should be going.
Shall I go, Dawn, or would you like?
Yes, go ahead. And I saw you were kind of trying to come in.
Well, I think, Laurie, you raised like really important question. I mean, I think and it's something that we're constantly in the Food Foundation discussing, whether we're getting the point where we draw the line right. I think we, as an organisation, feel we put as much effort into evidence and research as we do into engagement, not just communications and public affairs, but also building, close and trusted relationships with policymakers, parliamentarians, and also businesses, because we do a lot that's sort of business facing. And so where we then fit into that wider social movement is that we're often ones who are having more of the private conversations behind closed doors, while the social movement is pushing harder from the outside, which can create an area of sort of distinction, if you like, for yourself versus the wider body of campaigners. And I think also, slightly to pick up on what you just said, Enrique, I think sometimes the social movement can very helpfully push the boundaries of the conversation or expectations, wide open further than you think is possible to achieve. And in so doing, open a space for at least something to move forward, even if it doesn't go as far as that. So thinking about sort of recommendations and calls for action where you might, as a think tank, say, well, we'll focus on something which we think is kind of modest but achievable given the political context, whereas it's actually very beneficial if the social movement is pushing for something much harder to achieve and more ambitious, because they're creating that pressure for action, even if your expectations are that you won't ever get that at this point. So I don't know. I don't think there's an easy answer to your question. I think it's a really, really important question for organizations like ours. And for us, it's not an exact science, and we kind of are making those judgments on an ongoing basis in our work as to whether we're positioning ourselves in the right spot, and rely quite a lot on feedback from others as to whether they think we are.
Thank you. And Don, do you want to respond?
If I were to add on that, and I think it mirrors also a question, and I think some debate that's ongoing in the chat. I've seen like the question or the comment by Stephanie and so on. For us, in terms of our brand image, especially with those like people in government to whom we target, we haven't found that neutrality is such an important thing for them, that you'd be neutral of the thing or that you're not seen as activist. For us, we found more it's the quality of our message is the thing that drives whether we are accepted or not, and whether our work is accepted or not. So that's been our experience. I would imagine then on that question of whether you want to be seen as very activist or so on, I think, or whether you want to be seen as neutral on the issue, it may also depend on the issue. Maybe there's some issues in which it would be easier for think tanks to immerse themselves in the activism part of it than others. We found certainly for us, when we're talking about economic justice, that we can be a bit more activist on it without losing the respect or losing the acceptability of those that we target at intergovernmental bodies and at governmental bodies and so on. Maybe if it was an issue of democracy and especially working in country, then maybe if there's a social movement that says we want democratic change, and for them democratic change means the incumbent must leave, I think maybe in those circumstances, if you're a think tank that works around democracy, maybe you would feel if you're aligned very closely with that social movement, then you'll be seen as partisan and against one side of the divide. So maybe it'll be harder, I don't know. But our experience has been on the issue that we are in, it's been okay for us, and we've not suffered any brand damage by being more immersed in the social movement. And I think the climate change folks are the same, because I've seen also some think tanks that do research on climate change, but they're willing to be, quite prominent in movements and campaigns around it. So maybe the issue has something also to do with it.
Before I go to Andrea, who, by the way, is the author of the study on social movements and think tanks that I keep referring to, let me go to a question by Shannon Sutton. I think it refers to, maybe let me know, Shannon, if I got it right, but it's the other relationship. We have been talking about sort of what can think tanks do for social movements, providing them with advice, information, technical expertise, etc. The driving force maybe in some cases. But what about social movements providing the evidence, right? Providing the experiences, the information, access to those different stories that think tanks need to develop a better understanding of what's going on. Laurie, you talked about Ippr's relationship with farmers and farmer associations and grassroots. Clearly they are, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that, about the two-way relationship between the think tank and the farmers and the farmer associations. I don't know, Anna, if the campaign itself and the movement itself that came out of the work you've done, did in any way change your findings, change the kind of your level of understanding of the issues that you were working on?
Did you want me to go first, or Laura?
You've unmuted first, so I guess you volunteered.
I think what we found is that the process of convening the NGOs allowed us to pool data from multiple sources more effectively than we'd been able to do before. So just the convening process, we were able to kind of map out the evidence which different organizations were able to bring. And so that was an enriching process because it allowed us to look at the problem from multiple angles. So I don't think it changed our story, but it's enriched it for sure. And one other point that I just wanted to just go back, I realized I didn't make in response to Laura's earlier question was, as I mentioned, we work with citizens quite a lot, young food ambassadors in particular, people who've got lived experience themselves. I'm thinking of your kind of farmers as well, Laura, there. And what we found is that their voice, giving a platform for their voices, they can often be a lot more strident in their campaigning than we would want to be as an organization. So there we see them as kind of activists who are pushing the boundary. We're creating a platform for them to do so, but they're not, we don't in any way say you've got to take a Food Foundation line on this. You will tell you the evidence, and you've got to say it how you believe it to be based on your own lived experience. And so in that sense, that can also be quite a useful tool for sort of preserving your position, but working closely with people who are wanting to take a more activist stance.
Yeah, thank you. And Laura, maybe do you have any reflection about that two-way relationship between Ippr and farmers, and how that's cultivated, and what impact it has on how Ippr works and what they work on?
Over the time, we have seen a slight change in Ippr position. We started as babies of farmers' organization, and now we stand as a research organization working for multiple stakeholders, and not only the farmers' organization that created us. And this can create some frictions and some tensions, because the issues can be different. There are a lot of interest at stakes. So yeah, we are navigating these things with the farmers' organization. However, we have to say that we have splitted our work in two. We have the research part, and we also have the policy dialogue, policy influence part. And we make sure that it is represented by different persons. And in the media, we tend to have a set of persons going to the media and talking to others. And in the research analysis part, it's other people. So we have this dual personality within our organization, and we work this way. I don't know how others are doing it, but we tend to see that it's better to make a separation and say we do research, or it's not all our research that can help support advocacy or support social movements, but some of it can. And for this part, other people are crafting the message and work more closely with the farmers' organization, NGOs, and so on.
Great, thank you. And Keith McLean in the chat, I think it was an interesting point that we've been talking about active roles or involved roles of think tanks and movements, either providing evidence or advice, or getting evidence and learning from the participants of the movements. But they can also play the role of kind of monitors or observers of these initiatives, and learn from them, share their learning with others as well. So and if they're involved in the movement, they could even act as monitors of the movement, so that they can raise a flag if the movement is losing momentum or losing focus. And Deya, you've been waiting for a bit. Is there anything you wanted to?
Yes, I wanted to add a bit on what Dawn was saying a little bit before on the neutrality, and if it's either the organizations or the individuals that join social movements, and how that affects. I think another factor there is also the context, not only the topic, but the context in which the movement is playing out. So in the research that we did with AJOY data, we found also that in certain contexts, it was the individuals within the think tanks that worked actively and were happy to be associated both with the movement and with the organization. But in others, it was individuals that wanted to keep far away from think that they want to keep far away because of security and to keep their other roles as well, so they could keep advising government and working on other issues. So yeah, I think it depends as well on the context and the issue at hand. And then on the roles, what we found before is that so it's usually the think tanks partner with social movements, and they have some somewhat distinct roles. So it's the knowledge part came out very crucial as the think tanks providers of evidence and research. But there are other interesting roles were on knowledge translators in a way. So they were better at engagement, government officials, lawmakers, and other elites, and they were better at speaking the language that was needed to translate things into law. So sometimes social movements and more activist-oriented people are really good at getting the message out. They were really good at gathering people. They were really good at rising the masses, to say something. But when it was time for the law to be passed, for the law to be drafted, it was think tankers who usually got a seat at the table. That is an issue in itself that needs to be discussed, but that was the role that they used to play. So they were the moderators, they were the convener, and they were the translators of the lived experiences of people into what laws and what policies need to be passed. And one thing that I'd like to then ask everybody is, so this role of then being sat at the table with the policymakers, can be exclusive in a way so why is it think tankers sitting at the table and not other actors of the social movement? So that's one of the questions that we kept wondering. So I'll pose that to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Who'd like to take that? Don, since you're unmuted, I'm going to volunteer you.
Okay. I think that's a question there. And I think that then becomes an ethical question for those think tankers. True, I think there are instances where, as you've said, the fact that there's huge noise demanding something be done or something be changed, and you have access, you're able to use that access to translate the demands of the movement into something doable for whoever is the policy maker, government, or whoever that you're targeting. I think that's one. But I imagine also, especially if one comes from the point of view that you really believe in inclusive governance and participatory governance, it may also then become some sort of ethical responsibility for the think tank to help others also come through the door and be able to sit at the table. And we find ourselves doing that a bit, doing some introduction and say, so-and-so has also been trying to talk to you. Could you talk to them, and so on. Hand holding and so on, and then doing introductions and letting them go. So I think one, you can use, it's like kind of good cop, bad cop approach. You can use the fact that there's a huge call outside there to give a draft, to give a policy and push it and get it done. But also you might have the ethical responsibility to make sure other people get in through the door, not just yourself.
Great. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I think I'm going to ask Anna and Laura and Dawn if you have any final reflections from what you've heard, what you've shared, and anything you might want to add in terms of lessons for recommendations or implications for think tanks that want to engage with social movements, grassroots organizations, activists. And want to make a contribution. What should they be thinking about?
If I could say two quick things, and I call it
great.
First, maybe just this tussle of where we are. I've seen now a couple of think tanks describing themselves as think and do tanks. I've never really unpacked it with them to find out what that means, but I think there are those who are feeling that urge to be a bit more engaged. That's one. But second, to just say that I think I agree with the two comments put in the chat by Keith McLean, that perhaps one of the natural roles of a think tank within a movement could be to be some sort of chronicler, some sort of being able to track, monitor, and report on the outcomes, the results, what's changing, and so on. So we've ended up doing a bit of that. Even in terms of awareness raising, when we began talking about this issue 6-7 years ago, very few Africans even knew those words. So even you're able to track even who's talking about it now with what force, and then what changes are going on. So that could be one natural rule for many think tanks. Thanks.
Thank you. Anna?
So I think probably two reflections. I think focusing on what you can do well, I think is really important, and kind of concentrating your resources on the things that you know that you can do well. And I mean, certainly, Don, we've taken the sort of approach that you've said, well, we know that we can provide a regular sort of set of data on tracking food insecurity, and it's become kind of the go-to source. Everyone cites it. It's part of the ecosystem of evidence now that people are using who are campaigning around food poverty issues. And I think the other is that those relationships with other actors in a movement are, I think the other reflection I have is that they often require quite a lot of time investment and transaction costs, and sometimes it's not immediately obvious that those relationships are going to bear fruit. But I think in my experience, investing time in those relationships and building trust and collaborations often delivers things unexpectedly further down the line. And so I think don't be too ruthless about spending your time developing those relationships, even if you don't have an immediate kind of purpose for that collaboration. I think would be, you have to strike the right balance when you're a small kind of poorly resourced organization in, you know, how many of those conversations you get pulled into. But my advice, I think, would be not to be too strict with yourself in terms of those investments, because I think they often are investments for the future, which will help you further down the line.
Great. Let me ask you a quick follow-up question before we finish, and then I'll go to Laurie. But in this campaign, I mean, I was aware of the success of the campaign, and not living in the UK. What level of attribution, or has it provided the food fund? Is it your organization?
It hasn't delivered. I mean, we deliberately, Marcus was fronting it, the footballer, and we didn't try and claim loads of attribution at all. Not because we weren't proud of what we did. We absolutely were very proud of it, but it wasn't an important part of for us. We know we can talk to our funders about what we did, and at the end of the day, that kind of is all that, that's the only real reason to try and demonstrate the role that you play, is so that you can continue to be funded. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter as long as the change happens, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that was very much the spirit that we went into it with. Yeah.
Good. I guess I read this as a Ronald Reagan quote, but I don't know if it's true. But if you don't worry about attribution, then a lot more is possible.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think if you're working with social movement, that it's by nature sort of difficult to define. That's something you have to be ready to accept. And Laurie, if you can help us to close the session with a few final words.
Thank you. You are giving me a great way out. I think that successful collaboration between think tank and social movement is when we don't know who produced the evidence or the analysis, and it is taken up by the movement. But we always want to track our impact, and I think that one of the one of the learnings that I've got from this session is that when we work with social movement, we need to find ways to monitor, track our impact within this movement, but make sure that it is completely taken up and embraced by the other organization. Make sure that we let go of our data and our findings while tracking and monitoring. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Those are very wise and inspiring words. Thank you very much, Laurie. Anna, Dawn, thank you, Andrea, for joining us. I'm sorry that Laurie couldn't join us. I understand he lost his internet connection,
Yes.
but I've shared his report's findings and the link. This is a fascinating conversation. I hope we can continue it, but I'll let you go. For those who are staying on for the next session, we'll be back in 10 minutes. For those who can't, the videos will be out soon. But thank you very much for joining us. It has been a pleasure.